The Strangers Pray at Night is a sequel that defied what little expectations I had. At no point did I anticipate anything hopeful given it's a belated sequel releasing 10 years past the prime of the original, which in my experience is usually a red flag signaling cheap cash grab direct-to-video quality, but boy do I have no problem being wrong about that. Now, usually with my videos, I like to try and develop some sort of thesis as to why a particular film deserves a re-evaluation, and to be frank, there's nothing I can say about Pray at Night that suggests it's anything more than what it is. However, that's far from a bad thing. To me, the conditions I watched Pray at Night in were perfect for the type of film that it is. It's a casual Friday night home alone blanket on the couch detox after a long stressful week. It's not going to blow you away or show you anything you haven't seen before, but it scratches just the right itch to be a palatable, non-intrusive watch that sometimes is exactly what we all need. I guess if I had to come up with an actual reason for making this video, it's because I've been hyped up by seeing slashers make a promising return, as so far this year we've had a fun range of examples, from Scream to X to Bodies, 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 which I haven't seen, but the buzz from South by Southwest suggests it's awesome, to, dare I controversially say, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which is mindless splatter silliness as long as you ignore it having any connection to Texas Chainsaw. The thing about Pray at Night is that it seems like it was done dirty by its marketing, because I did not know it even came out, and was completely indifferent to its existence until I finally saw it on Netflix a year or so after its release. And if I'm being brutally honest, it's one of those rare sequels I'd argue is kinda better than the original in some ways. In fact, while writing this video, I decided to look it up, and while it was pretty much forgotten, likely due to it being a cult-followed IP, the critical consensus was nowhere near as negative as I expected. If anything, it seems to be just as polarizing as the original, that, understandably, you'll either love it or hate it. Like its predecessor, Pray at Night tells a fairly minimalistic story about an average family who plan to stay at their relative's secluded trailer park for one last family vacation before their rebellious daughter Kinsey goes to boarding school. But upon arrival, they quickly encounter three mysterious masked strangers who proceed to stalk, toy, and eventually murder them one by one. Now, the conceit of the original, which I covered many years ago, is this brutal emphasis on meaningless random acts of violence, as its creator Brian Bartino framed the story around news articles and true stories about gruesome home invasions where the perpetrators lacked motive or any connection to their victims. Essentially, it was the purest and bleakest demonstration of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. It poses the harrowing question of, what if you were home alone one night minding your own business, and suddenly, without any causality, a group of people broke in and mercilessly attacked you? It's not a unique setup by any means, but bluntly speaking, it's still a fucking horrifyingly real idea that was once a deeply unpleasant staple within the genre during the 70s and 80s, when real serial killers and unprovoked violence were prominent fear-mongering stories within local news. Hell, it's actually fairly reductive to even call the original a slasher movie. It's more of a situational thriller that deliberately avoids most of the sensationalism of the genre, if indeed I think the film makes a few missteps that hurt the overall feeling of authenticity. I won't say much more than that because I already did a video talking about it, but for those not in the know, Pray at Night is also framed around the same rotten bad luck, where shit happens is an understatement because they're practically in a murderous septic tank full of it. I think one of the reasons this sequel sticks in my head more than it should is because it surprisingly gets better as it goes along. The second half is a really gratifying payoff for what is a very by-the-numbers trepidatious introduction. Obviously, I want to avoid spoilers just for now, but let's just say that as cliche as it sounds, Prey at Night ends up subverting its own concept in a rather peculiar way. What immediately stands Prey at Night apart from the original for both better and worse is that it leans on the 80s revival zeitgeist popularized by Stranger Things. It takes a similar approach to 2015's The Guest, where it's a modern aesthetic built around an 80s polish that exists almost exclusively for flair rather than any emotional or thematic purpose. On the one hand, it does detract from the stern, gritty, mundane feel of the original to give it more momentum, but I didn't really mind it because thankfully it never overindulges on being an exhausting nostalgia gimmick. Although, on the other hand, if I'm being rather nitpicky, I feel it would have been more appropriate to lean on a 70s aesthetic, given it's the era that most defined the genre The Strangers is modeled after, especially with the original's very apparent Texas Chainsaw style opening title card. However, bear with me here, because the more I think about it, one of the elements I really liked about the use of 80s nostalgia was how frequently it juxtaposes its disco-esque 80s soundtrack with that cold, disquieting misery established in the original. There's this palpable, funky, energetic intrusion that constantly tries to break its way through in a sort of ironic way as the characters persist in their suffering, and what it does is creates this flickering presence of joy and harmony that's completely out of reach. As such, it makes me backtrack a little to say that the spirit of the 80s effectively becomes an emotional trigger of happy idealism that's drowned out by the morbid grimness of everything around it. Admittedly, I'm struggling to articulate what I mean exactly. In fact, I've seen it in several movies before, like when a character has their earphones in and they don't notice something bad happening behind them or something like that. There's just something a little inherently twisted about having this fun, inspirational music that tonally contradicts what we're seeing. It's like how Texas Chainsaw used daylight. The tone is completely foreign to the atmosphere, and it makes things more uncomfortable because it's both jarring and somehow uncanny. Anyway, let's climb out of that confusing stylistic rabbit hole I seem to have backed myself into and talk about the setup itself. While the sequel doesn't have the persistent melancholic elements of the original, I quite liked all the characters, even if there is very little to them. They're relatable, awkward, and stubborn around each other, and there is a mildly compelling conflict built around the daughter Kinsey being forced to go to boarding school for a vague reason that's insinuated to be the result of something bad that she did. It still maintains the distant camera work to reinforce both the tense relationships and, of course, the voyeuristic and often ambiguous impression that the camera is essentially eyes lurking in the background. The noticeable use of dead space to reinforce the isolation also helps to create some sense of anticipation for where the killers might be. If you've seen the original, you'll probably go in with a certain mindset already, so I'm curious to know what people think if this is their first experience of the Strangers, because there is quite an uncertain build-up to their eventual attack. Side note, however, I do love how they humanize the killers more by extending beyond just showing them standing menacingly in the background to seeing them bailing it out of frame to set themselves up for the next scare. The unseen teleportation shenanigans you expect from Jason and Michael Myers are demystified here, and while on the surface I wasn't a fan of how much copy and paste they were doing regarding the harassment, in a meta sense we are playing on the killer's self-established formula, so the fact that it's less effective reflects on how old and tired their methods have become, but I'll come back to that in the spoiler section. Lastly, we have the trailer park itself, which is fine. I think it's meant to play off the whole summer camp aesthetic of slasher flicks, but by going for something so seemingly random and unimaginative, it fits the whole element of inconsequentiality and believability. It's not, strictly speaking, a conventional genre setting. It's certainly not as powerful as the single house in the middle of nowhere, and it does push the probability by justifying the absence of other people as due to Labor Day, which could be true, but I don't have the knowledge to share an opinion on that. Right, so now is the time I think we should talk about that gratifying third act, because while it does somewhat conflict with the principles of the original, that's not to say it isn't entirely unrealistic. Brace yourself, spoilers ahead. Firstly, I like how the film relies on visual storytelling to set up the attack, by having the intro see the family's grandparents be the victims, before later discovering a voice message that indicates the family's imminent arrival. Thus, the strangers were able to anticipate their next victims. However, if you've seen the original, you'll understand how seemingly casual and undeterred the strangers are about their actions. They clearly have fun prolonging their victims' suffering, with the father Mike's death in particular being so gruelingly cruel that it hammers in the point that the odds are definitely not in the family's favour. The same could be said about the mother Cindy, where her blood is crudely painted on the walls, furthering that sadistic, uncaring feel of the strangers. Additionally, leaving the siblings Kinsey and Luke until last seems like easy prey to the strangers, but this is where the film takes an unexpected U-turn. You see, it's initially established that both Kinsey and Luke are growing estranged from each other, and so when desperate times call for desperate measures, they ultimately end up strengthening their bond, much like the couple in the original, who rekindle their love just before things go to utter shit again. But the difference in outcome is that remarkably, Kinsey and Luke actually turn the strangers' cockiness against them, with the colourful pool scene being a particular highlight, where Luke gets a lucky shot on one of them before finishing the job. There are several back and forths in this scene that really hold the anxiety of whether or not Luke would actually win, especially when the scarecrow looking stranger arrives and they have a wet t-shirt contest in the pool. It's beautifully shot, but I have to be careful with the censoring on this one, yet Luke does unfortunately lose the fight, which felt so immensely deflating and demoralizing because he puts in such a brilliant effort that it really compounds the brutality that the strangers truly conveys. This leaves Kinsey presumably as the final girl to eventually shoot one of them and set the other alight, but this motherfucker does not go down easily, and much like Luke's scene, there is a painfully prolonged anxiety where hope constantly dwindles and lessens. However, there is a tangible catharsis when Kinsey finally finishes off the final stranger and gets away. It feels incredibly earned, and once more, the fact that Luke actually turns out to have survived brings a pretty overwhelming sense of relief I rarely feel in slasher movies. The reason for this is because by the time I saw Prey at Night, a lot of horrors came with the expectation that bleak and nihilistic endings were inevitable, which is exactly how the original ends. Yet the subversion comes from going against the mean-spirited trend of letting the world burn, and showing that just because everyone dies or the killers win, doesn't necessarily make it more realistic. In a paradoxical, even contradictory sense, having a somewhat happy ending, granted there is a cheap ambiguity to the hospital door knocking, is shocking in its own right. I did not expect anyone to live, and I gotta say, there's something rather special about being able to flood a range of high emotions into an ending that, in all respects, is unremarkably traditional. Look, The Strangers Prey at Night is not game-changing. Hell, it is far from even being the best modern slasher, but I know for a fact that I'm not alone in saying that it still deserves a bit more love. So until next time, stay safe, stay away from strangers, and I'll see you all very soon. Bye.